Hi, my name is Carrie Rinker, and I'm going to be presenting today on drafting embryo transfer contracts for livestock producers. For those of you that don't know me, I am a cattle girl. I grew up in central Illinois, showing cattle through 4-H and FFA. My family actually did, we use artificial insemination and embryo transfer. My dad has been doing embryo transfer for decades. And so I wanted to highlight that from my experience. Not only am I a cattle girl, but my family operation does do this very thing. I come from a seed stock cattle operation, which means that my family raises breeding livestock. We primarily breeding livestock and also cattle that's used like in 4-H. The state fairs and cattle shows are going on around the country. Those are the types of animals that my family raises. And I highlight that because this is predominantly used in seed stock cattle operations. Now, embryo transfer is also used in commercial operations as well, and we'll talk about that applicability. But I just wanted to highlight that families like my own, this is exactly the scenario where embryo transfer is oftentimes used. I have degrees in animal science. I actually have an associate's degree in agriculture from Lakeland College, which is the junior college that I went to near my hometown. And then I transferred to Texas A&M University, where I have a bachelor's in animal science. I was on the livestock judging team both at Lakeland and at Texas A&M. And then right after I interned on Capitol Hill, which made me want to go to law school, I had a master's degree from the University of Illinois in ruminant nutrition. I did not do my master's thesis on embryo transfer, but I did do it on genetic DNA markers. And I just highlight that here today because I am going to be talking a lot about the animal science behind embryo transfers. Of course, I went to law school right out here in this geographic part of the country. I got my JD from Pace University School of Law. The law school is in White Plains, New York. And I have my own food and agricultural law practice right here in New York City, nearby in Midtown Manhattan. I serve livestock producers, agriculture business owners, and also increasingly food entrepreneurs. I'm pretty actively involved in the livestock industry. Just 2 weeks ago, I was judging a cattle fair, cattle show in upstate New York, and I'm currently the chairperson of the American Bar Association General Practice Solo and Small Firm Divisions Agriculture Law Committee. I'll be moderating 2 CLEs for the ABA in the coming months. For those of you that are listening to the live broadcast or the recording and that are interested in getting more involved professionally in the agriculture law community, I would love for you to get in touch with me about this committee. So today, as I mentioned, I am going to be giving a little bit of an animal science lesson. And the reason for that is because I think you need to understand the animal science on what's taking place here before your legal eyes can really review and draft one of these contracts. So I'm going to be giving just a general background. What is embryo transfer? Why is it used? What are the costs? What is the applicability in the livestock industry? And then I'm going to be delving into the contracts itself. I'm going to be concentrating on embryo transfer contracts with cattle today. Undoubtedly, cattle is going to be the concentration, with more so even a focus on beef cattle as opposed to dairy cattle, although I think a lot of the terminology and the contract provisions are going to be similar, okay? But there is going to be more of an emphasis on the beef cattle industry versus the dairy cattle industry. Then I'm going to move on to other species, sheep, goats, pigs, horses, and then I'm going to close with some general considerations that no matter what type of embryo transfer contract you're drafting or reviewing, you should consider. All right, so as I mentioned, I just want to reiterate, this presentation today does focus on cattle, and that's for 2 reasons. Number 1, embryo transfer is primarily done in cattle. It's predominantly in the cattle industry, okay? And second of all, it's my comfort level. This is where my education is, this is where my background is. I can speak to more a higher detail when it comes to embryo transfer contracts with cattle as opposed to, let's say, horses. But I do know some equine lawyers that focus on embryo transfer contracts with horses. So please feel free to email me after this presentation, and I would be happy to connect you or send you a link to their resources. All right, first and foremost, let's set the background here. What is embryo transfer? Okay, so you know, when a semen fertilizes an egg, it creates an embryo. Okay, so and that embryo can literally, you know, the genetics do not have to take place naturally. That is what an embryo transfer contract is doing. We're selecting a donor cow that has superior genetics. We're going to super ovulate that donor cow, which means she is going to produce more than one egg at a specific estrus cycle. Okay, then we're going to inseminate that donor cow. All right, and then after that insemination, there will be invariably, or hopefully, some embryos that will take place. Those embryos will then be evaluated under a microscope, all right? And then transferred, hopefully, into a recipient cow. That recipient cow needs to be selected and prepared before that transfer needs to take place. Those are the basic steps, and I am going to actually go through each of these steps here very quickly, just so you can understand the general background behind all of this. And this picture I just wanted to point out is my brother and I at the Illinois State Fair. This is his champion cow-calf pair. He was very proud that day. All right, so let's start off with the selection of the donor cow. And I just want to back up very briefly. I do have an outline of materials that I have prepared today. And at page 1, there is a short history on embryo transfer. Please read at your leisure, but there's some interesting history here. The very first embryo transfer was actually done with rabbits. All right, so the selection of the donor cow, and this is not something that as an attorney that I get involved with and I opine with my clients on selecting the best donor cow, but I think it's important to understand a little bit of the industry and what's going on in our client's head. So the donor cow is going to be a female with superior genetics. And what is superior to me, or what is superior to my family's cattle operation, might not be superior to somebody else. Every operation is going to have different goals depending on their program. As I mentioned at the very onset of today's presentation, my family raises show cattle primarily. It's primarily what we do. So we're going to be looking at things differently from a matter of phenotype, okay, than operations maybe that are commercial and going to be focusing more on carcass characteristics, right? My family's cattle operation also puts a high emphasis on genetic strength. What do I mean by that? Well, most cattle breed associations have expected progeny differences, or EPDs. And furthermore, there are some people that want to make sure the donor cow has a genetic DNA marker for something specific, like marbling or tenderness or feed efficiency. Okay, there could be qualitative characteristics that the cattle owner is going to be looking for. So what do I mean by that? Well, maybe that cattle owner wants to have a donor cow that is homozygous black, okay, or red, or specifically wants to have all the cattle be polled in their cow herd. So those would be various qualitative characteristics. Reproductive soundness is usually an important characteristic of any good donor cow. General health, body condition score, and perhaps even breed registration. Cattle do not need to be registered to be a donor cow, but oftentimes cattle operations will want some type of representation or proof that the donor cow is registered, like registered with the American Simmental Association or the American Angus Association. More information on the selection of donor cow is enumerated on pages 7 through 8 in your outline. All right, let's get to the science part of it. So the next step, after we select the donor cow, we've picked out the cream of the cream, right? She's the donor cow that we're going to super ovulate. So now we need a super ovulator. So the super ovulation takes place, as I mentioned, so she can release multiple eggs, okay, during one estrus cycle. This is done by using a follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. There are different brands. My dad prefers the one that's shown here on the screen, the Folitropin V. This is the one my dad uses. But there are other competitors out there. So this FSH hormone is injected twice a day for 4 days. Okay. Then a prostaglandin injection is then given on the 3rd day of the treatment to schedule then a corpus luteum regression on the ovary. And then heat or estrus will then occur about 2 to 3 days later. More specifically, it's about 48 to 60 hours afterwards. Okay, so at this time, the cow will likely produce about 7 to 20 eggs, and about 5 to 15 will be transferable. And more information on the super ovulation of the donor cow is on pages 8 to 9 in your outline. Step 3 is the insemination of the donor cow, right? So now she's super ovulated, all right? She's got all of these eggs. Now we need to inseminate her, okay? So a cow is typically bred by artificial insemination. Doesn't have to be artificial insemination. She could be bred naturally with a live bull, or but usually it's with artificial insemination. And my family has been using artificial insemination for as long as I can remember. So as far as I was an itty bitty girl, we were using artificial insemination on our farm. And the cost for an AI straw is going to vary significantly depending on the type of bull, the quality, how popular that given bull is. Economics 101, supply and demand. I mean, there are some bulls where there's just very limited semen available. So the cost of the straw could range from $25 to $300. Just that's for the straw, the semen. Okay, and you know, just like you want to, cattle producers are going to pick the best of the best of the donor cow. Likely, they're going to also pick the best of the best for the sire, okay, as well, because there's a lot of money that goes into this type of a transaction, and there's an emphasis on superior genetics. All right, so the cow is usually bred at 8, 16, and 24-hour intervals after standing heat. Okay, so what does standing heat mean? That means that she's basically at estrus, and the term standing heat comes from if you were going to put that cow out in pasture, and a bull or frankly another cow would, you know, would literally like hump her basically, and the cow would stand still. If she was not in what's called the standing heat or estrus, then she would move. But instead she would stand still to be bred. It's a physiological reaction. All right, step 4 is the flushing of the embryos. All right, once the donor cow is bred, the embryos are collected non-surgically, and this is with cattle, it's non-surgically, and we'll talk about later with sheep, goats, pigs, that there's oftentimes a surgical procedure, but with cattle, it's a non-surgical procedure. And this is done by inserting a rubber catheter through the cervix of the donor cow approximately 7 to 8 days after estrus. The embryos are then flushed and harvested from the donor cow, and this process takes about 30 minutes. Procedures at this point are fairly technical, but essentially the embryos are put into a cylinder with flushing fluid. So that's what's taking place during this stage. As we have the embryos and we're taking them out of the donor cow, okay? And then the next step is those embryos are then evaluated under a microscope. And they're evaluated for two things. One is grade, and the second is stage. And more information on grade and stage are found on pages 9 and 10 in your outline. Let's first talk about grades. And this is really important to understand from a legal side because the contract itself might refer to a grade 1 embryo, okay? So it's important for the drafter or the reviewing attorney to understand what these grades mean, all right? There are grades 1 through 4 in the embryos. Grade 1 is the best, 4 is the worst, and usually only grade 1 embryos are used for freezing. Sometimes I have seen grade 2 embryos also be used, but the contract should and will probably refer to a grade 1 embryo. And let's talk about stages next. So there are over 9 stages of embryos. Stage 1 is basically an unfertilized egg, and then it goes through the different stages. Stages 4, 5, and 6 are actually the best for freezing and thawing procedures. I have seen mentions of stages in these embryo contracts, but it's not as popular as references to the grades, okay? But I think it's important for attorneys to understand the different stages here and focusing in on these stages 4 through 6. And more information on the types of stages are found on pages 9 and 10 again in the outline. All right, so once the embryos have been reviewed under the microscope for both grade and stage, the next step is to select the recipient cow, which realistically, this has probably already been done, okay, from the onset of this process. But the Recept should be reproductively sound, have good milking ability and maternal characteristics, have good calving hips for adequate calving ease, a good body condition score, and should be in good health. But we're not looking at the recipient's EPDs, we're not looking at her genetic DNA markers, we're not as concerned about her phenotype as the donor cow. The donor cow is the one with the supreme genetics. The recipient cow, she's the mama, right? She's the one that's going to be, she's like the surrogate, right? Like she's going to be having the calf grow inside of her and then potentially milking her through weaning, okay? So with picking out a Recept cow, your clients should stay away from using heifers. Heifers do not make good Recepts, okay? And docility is also a factor. What's docility? Talking about the calmness of the nature, right? She's the mom. We don't care as much about her genetics and her phenotype, but she needs to be a good mama, and she needs to be easy to work around. So those are the types of factors that I think that make a good donor cow. More information on this is found on page 10. All right, so once we've picked out the good mama, the good Recept, we have to prepare her for the embryo transfer. All right, the recipient cow's estrus cycle should be synced to the donor cow's cycle with the use of prostaglandin or a CEDAR, okay, which is controlled intrauterine device release, okay, a CEDAR. And there's a picture of a CEDAR right there. And we do use CEDARs at the Rinker Ranch, so I've been a part of that insertion. The timing of the Recept cow's estrus should match the time of the insemination of the donor cow so that the uterine environment is similar approximately 7 days later, okay, when the transfer is going to take place, all right? So a lot of these steps are taking place concurrently, all right? So basically we're syncing the estrus cycle with the Recept and the donor cow during this stage. And more information on preparing the Recept cow is found on page 10. All right, so we've extracted the embryos, we've evaluated the embryos, we've prepared the Recept cow. The next step is to transfer the embryos into the recipient cow, okay? So an embryo is transferred into the recipient cow by loading the embryo into an insemination straw with the aid of a syringe. The ovaries are palpated, which means felt, rectally to determine that the ovary has in fact ovulated. The embryo is then placed on the same side as the ovary with the active corpus luteum. Okay, this should only be performed by a trained ET technician. A great care should be taken on the lining of the uterus and not to be damaged. And as somebody who has done rectal palpation myself, it takes some talent to get in there and some training on to be able to feel that active CL. Okay, so but once the transfer has taken place, then hopefully the pregnancy will go through. All right, and that's the transaction that's taking place here, and we'll go through things in more detail. So why is this even used? Okay, well, let's think about things in terms of cattle. So a heifer or a cow will generally have about one calf per year. All right, so if you think about the lifespan of a cow, during her life, she might only have about 9 to 13 calves, depending on, how old she is, how old she lives. A maximum about 14, 15 years would probably be the most that a cow would use. But if you have a great cow with superior genetics, wouldn't you want to have as much of her genetics as possible? So this is how embryo transfer is used, and we'll talk a little bit more about numbers later, but if you remember, the hope is that about 5, good embryos can be used from a flush. Multiply that times the number of years that a cow is alive and healthy, and there's a lot of calves that one cow could propagate or to produce. Okay. More information on why use embryo transfer is found on page 2 of your outline. Let's talk a little bit about costs. And I have to say that the numbers that I've used here in this presentation are conservative. From my experience, the numbers can be quite a bit higher. So I just wanted to give everybody a little bit of a warning about that. So the cost can vary significantly. Now, Oklahoma State University has reported a minimum cost of about $250. I think that's definitely on the low side, but as a minimum floor, I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. But this number excludes several things. It excludes pharmaceuticals used for superovulation and also for the synchronization. It excludes breed registration. I think I mentioned this before about registering with the American Simmental Association, the American Angus Association, Hereford Association, the list can go on and on. Any embryo transfer certificates to verify the grade or the stage of the embryo, any semen that needs to get purchased. Remember I mentioned $25 to $300 a straw is a pretty big deviation. And room and board, right? We had to maintain the cow and then potentially the cow-calf pair, pasture, feed, etc., potentially veterinary expenses. And all of these extra costs could be minimally another $400, but could be multiples of that figure. More information on costs is on pages 2 to 3 in my outline. I wanted to point out that, I have seen with my clients, not so much with my own family, but with my clients, that international transactions are possible with these frozen embryos. Same thing with, semen and also with embryos. I just wanted to, for the attorneys that are listening here today, to pay attention to any special regulations from the importing company that may affect the transaction there. All right, so there are 3 basic types of embryo transfer contracts. And I just want to preface this by saying these are my terms. Your client is not going to come in and say, I need a breeder agreement or I need a recipient agreement. they're probably going to come in and say, I need an embryo transfer contract, or maybe I just need a contract. But this is how I have divided things up in my own mind for the last few years on how to sort all these out, because I think that these are three different kinds of transactions. One is the recipient agreement, two is the breeder agreement, and three is the flush agreement. Now these can be combined a little bit, and we'll talk about that more in a second. All right, let's first talk about the recipient agreement. So this is where a cattle producer is selling a bred embryo transfer recipient cow and or the embryo transfer calf to another cattle producer. Okay, so the transfer has already taken place, and then the actual pregnant cow, okay, or the cow and the calf later are then sold to the breeder. That's a recipient agreement transaction. So let's walk through this, because I think it's really important to understand how these transactions come into play in order to draft or review this. Okay, so let's look at an example transaction, and I've termed Farmer Rinker entering into a contract with Farmer Smith. Okay, so Farmer Rinker in this transaction is a breeder. Okay, and so this would sort of be like a transaction that my dad would actually enter into with Farmer Smith. Okay, so Farmer Smith is one of two things. He's either a non-certified embryologist, and if he is, then he then takes the recipient cow to an embryologist. An example of an embryologist is Transnova. Okay, or Farmer Smith could be a certified embryologist himself. So he's going to be one or two things. Is he an embryologist or is he not an embryologist? I wanted to note that Colorado State University is an example of an entity that certifies embryologists. I also wanted to note that there are other vet schools that certified embryologists, but you do not need to be a veterinarian to be an embryologist. It's a little bit like lawyers and mediators, right? A lot of lawyers are mediators. A lot of mediators are lawyers, but you don't have to be a lawyer to be a mediator. So it's the same thing with embryologists and veterinarians. So with this transaction, the embryologist needs embryos to transfer into the recipient cow. It's the whole point, right, of the transfer. Right? So one of two things takes place here. Either the frozen embryos can be shipped from another cattle operation, maybe a cattle operation of Farmer Rinker's choice, or alternatively, a donor female is already at the embryologist's site where she was recently flushed. Okay, so this is actually what my dad does quite often. Is he'll take a cow from our own farm to the embryologist, right? And then the embryologist will then do the flushing. So one of those two things is taking place. Fresh embryos or frozen embryos are then transferred to the recipient cow. Right, the recipient owner then must confirm the pregnancy. Just because the embryo was transplanted into the recept didn't mean that it took, right? There's a lot of things that go along physiologically, and some take and some don't. So what happens is, as a first step, is the recept cow goes home and then we wait 2 to 3 weeks. Well, where do we even get that figure? Well, the estrus cycle is 21 days with cows. Like for humans it's 28 days, for cattle it's 21 days. So that's why we're waiting, realistically it's going to be 3 weeks. And we're going to wait to see if she's in standing heat. And I was mentioning this before, and this is exactly what's happening in this picture right now, is this female is in standing heat. She's getting ridden right now, and she's standing. And if she was not in her estrus cycle, she would be moving away from it. All right, so the recipient owner is going to, let's just say there was no standing heat. We think that the cow is pregnant. Now the recipient owner then needs to confirm the pregnancy for Farmer Rinker. This is done at about 45 days, okay? So Farmer Smith then performs a pregnancy check, and this is usually done by rectal palpation, and that's what's happening right here in this cattle chute, okay? So let's just say the Farmer Smith says, you know, this percentage of the cows are then pregnant, and then notifies Farmer Rinker about what happened. And then Farmer Rinker says, great, but I want you to triple check at 60 days, and the embryo transfer contract will probably enumerate these various steps of pregnancy checking, okay? At 60 days, there might be an extra layer where Farmer Rinker might require that there be an ultrasound check, okay? And this could be done to determine determine the sex of the calf, right? Is it a bull or is it a heifer? That's one thing that could take place. That's if sex semen is not used. I want to point out that these layers of pregnancy checking, right, at 45 and 60 days have costs associated with it. Farmer Smith is literally having to put the Recept cow in the chute and do a rectal palpation or an ultrasound. Okay, so there's typically charges with this that are done. Whether or not the cow is confirmed pregnant or not, there's usually a charge of between $5 to $10, and that's for the pregnancy check at 45 days. If ultrasound is done, I've seen an additional $25 to $30 done for the ultrasound, especially if it includes a sex determination, okay? Determining whether or not it's a male or a female. Now, during this time where we're trying to figure out whether the Recept cows are pregnant or not, usually Farmer Rinker doesn't owe any money for these cows. It's only after they're actually confirmed pregnant. Because you remember, in this transaction was taking place, is that Farmer Rinker is buying the pregnant cow. Right? That's what he's buying. So if the cows aren't pregnant, he's not going to pay any money. So payment usually is not due until after 60 days. And I think these are important things for the reviewing or the drafting attorney to keep in mind with these transactions. And I wanted to note these are some pictures of me judging recently at a county fair in upstate New York. So I'm getting my 4-H county fair carry on in a few of these pictures, as you'll see. All right, so let's continue down this transaction. Farmer Rinker will pay Farmer Smith X number of dollars per cow that's confirmed pregnant. Okay, you got three confirmed pregnant cows, great. And then the contract should say the amount of money that Farmer Rinker owes Farmer Smith per cow. So not every Recept cow is going to be pregnant in that. So in this hypothetical, let's say there are 5 pregnant cows. So then there are a few options that are going to take place here. There needs to be a pickup of the recipient cow or possibly also the calf. So the question is, what kind of agreement is it? One option is Farmer Rinker will pick up the 5 pregnant recipient cows within a 70-day period and pay, the amount that's owed for the cows that are confirmed. So I gave this presentation actually a few years ago in Lubbock, Texas at Texas Tech. And at that time, I said $1,800 to $2,200. And these things have become more expensive now. And now the range, I'd say, is between $1,800 to $3,200. And that's how much, I have seen sort of as the industry on how much these pregnant cows are purchased for. If Farmer Rinker does not pick up the cow-calf on time, then under the terms of the contract, there are usually late fees. And this is because there are additional expenses for Farmer Smith, right? He's having to take care and feed, that cow might get sick. There's additional expenses that are taking place here. And this penalty could be assessed on a daily boarding fee. So it's maybe for every day that you're late after this date, then an X dollar fee is going to apply, and then after 100 days it's going to go up to this amount. So that's something that I've seen done in the contracts. Option 2. So option 1, farmer rinker goes to pick up within 70 days. Option 2 is the cow has the calf on Farmer Smith's property and basically milks the calf until weaning time. When's weaning? Well, that should be enumerated in the embryo transfer contract. So typically on the industry works, the weaning is done between 4 to 6 months of age. But when I was in graduate school, part of my master's research was dealing with early weaned cattle that were weaned at about 2 months of age. So, the date of weaning should also be identified in the contract itself. So typically though, in this transaction, farmer rinker will only get the embryo transfer calf and not the cow, all right? So he'll pay for the calf a certain amount of money as discussed in the contract. Let's go on with this transaction. So farmer rinker then takes the ET calf home, or possibly also the Recipient cow. It depends on the contract. If farmer rinker uses an embryo that he does not own, for example, he's purchased it from another producer with a flesh agreement, and we'll talk about flesh agreements in just a few minutes, then most cattle breed associations are then going to require verification of the parentage of both the dam, which is the mom, and the sire, which is the dad, before the registration will be allowed. And this could be done with a genetic test like a hair sample. You get out some pliers, you pull out about 50 hairs or so from the tail, and you stick it in a bag and you get it sent off. So that's how these genetic tests are sometimes performed. Farmer rinker, importantly, is the person that's applying for registration, not Farmer Smith. Remember, Farmer Smith is guy with the Recipient cows, guy or girl with the Recipient cows. If Farmer rinker does not pay his fee to Farmer Smith, then the embryo transfer contract may ask Farmer rinker to assign the embryo transfer calf's registration paper to Farmer Smith as security. And I have seen this provision a few times in an embryo transfer contract. All right, so that's a general overview of a transaction with a Recept agreement, but what's typically done? Well, what I have seen, unfortunately, is that Farmer Smith in this transaction will be the guy who has the contract, not really Farmer rinker, all right? And we'll talk about what Farmer rinker should do in just a second. But Farmer Smith usually has this contract, and I call it the Recipient Agreement. He shows it to Farmer rinker. Farmer rinker doesn't really feel like he can negotiate any of the terms, as oftentimes I've found that farmers and livestock producers don't even feel like they can change the terms of the contract, much better yet call an attorney to review it. That recipient agreement oftentimes is not drafted by an attorney, but I think it should. And I have certainly gotten involved in trying to draft these agreements, and I've been involved also on the reviewing side. But from a practical standpoint, attorneys need to know that these transactions are mostly being done with a handshake, okay? So what Farmer rinker should have is sort of a breeder agreement that he gives Farmer Smith, and we'll talk about that here in just a few minutes. Some other provisions to consider are, what are the payment terms? Is there going to be any late payment instructions there? Are there going to be any management terms for the recipient cow? Instructions for the receipt of the shipment of the frozen embryos? Any transfer fees for open cows? Dates, procedures, costs associated with pregnancy checks. If you remember, I mentioned at 45 days, there's a rectal palpation. There's usually about a $5 to $10 fee. And then sometimes there's an ultrasound fee that could be as high as $25 to $30. And that is just a fee, whether or not they're pregnant or not pregnant, but the contract should specify that and should be really clear. What I have seen with the embryo transfer fees for open cows could just be a basic $50 fee. So that's something that I have seen, although there's certainly some variety that takes place. Here are some more provisions to consider: whether or not there should be an embryo transfer fees for the open cow, dates, procedures, and costs associated with pregnancy checks. And I'm sorry, we just talked about that. All right, also the duration that the recipient cow will stay under the care of the owner. If you recall, in our example transaction, Farmer Rinker had two choices. Is he going to pick up the Recept within 70 days, or is the Recept cow going to go ahead and have the calf, and Farmer Rinker is going to pick up the calf after weaning, right? So the embryo transfer contract or the Recept agreement should specify that. And if there are any daily boarding maintenance fees for the recipient cow, such as for feed or for pasture. Here are a couple more provisions to consider, and then we'll move on quickly here to the breeder agreement. But is there any reimbursement for routine veterinary care or transportation expenses, for example? You know, what if Farmer Smith is transporting the cow, the pregnant cow, or the cow and the calf to Farmer Rinker? Is Farmer Rinker going to reimburse Farmer Smith for that? A limitation of liability of congenital birth defects. So we don't want Farmer Smith to really be responsible for any birth defects that are outside of his or her control. And that's, of course, if you represent Farmer Smith, right? So, and also a limitation of reasonable birthing difficulties, or the scientific word, if you want to talk cattle speak, would be dystocia, okay? That's calving difficulty. So we don't want you know, if, let's say if Farmer Smith, you know, picked out the Recept cow and stupidly picked a first-time heifer, okay? So he shouldn't have done that. He shouldn't pick a first-time heifer for a Recept cow, and that heifer has a lot of calving difficulties. Well, if you represent Farmer Rinker in that scenario, you want Farmer Smith to be liable for his or her stupidity on using a first-year heifer for that type of for having those type of calving difficulties. So these types of provisions could be enumerated in the agreement. Here are a few more. As I mentioned, the security on the embryo transfer progeny if the bill is unpaid, or the assignment of registration papers, which I have seen. Additional fees for genetic testing, like with marbling, feed efficiency, tenderness. And I've rarely seen, although it's an option, provisions dealing with marketing services. More information on this can be found on page 14 in the outline. Let's talk now about the breeder agreement. Remember the situation with Farmer Rinker and Farmer Smith. Farmer Smith might come to your office and either ask you to draft or to review a recipient agreement, okay? And that agreement might not really look out for Farmer Rinker's best interest. So Farmer Rinker, I think, should have his or her breeder agreement ready to go to give to Farmer Smith, to have Farmer Smith agree to a few things. Okay, so in an ideal world, the recipient agreement and the breeder agreement would be together in one master contract, and that would certainly be ideal, but realistically that doesn't always take place. So breeders should make sure that the recipient owner agrees to bear the burden that the recipient cow is in good health, obtains necessary vaccinations, is within an appropriate age range. Remember, we just talked about Farmer Smith using a heifer, right? We don't want to use any virgin heifers as a recipient cow, all right? And sometimes you could have the recipient cow be of a certain breed or a color pattern. You know, for example, my family uses a lot of Simmental or Simmental Angus cross cattle that are predominantly black or red. I happen to love red cattle. You know, I would love a whole cow herd full of red cows. And if that was if I was actually buying the Recept cow to come back with me on the farm, perhaps I just want to have a cow pasture full of red cows. And if that's the case, then, perhaps you want to have that Farmer Smith, the Recept owner, promise that the cows are going to be of a certain breed or color pattern. And then you could have Farmer Smith, the Recept owner, agree that the Recept cow is going to be structurally sound. The breeder agreement could also have a provision relating to tort liability. Specifically, the cattle breeder, Farmer Rinker, may want to hold the recipient owner, Farmer Smith, liable for gross negligence or intentional misconduct relating to the care of the recipient cow and her progeny, including but not limited to birth complications. And this would be an example of what I just talked about a few minutes ago with the heifer, right? Like that could be considered gross negligent. Like what were you thinking? You're using a first calf heifer as a Recept cow. Of course she's gonna have calving difficulties. And not only did the cow, but the calf died at birth, something like that. So that would be a potential provision that the breeder would be interested in having. And the breeder may also want to have the Recept owner, Farmer Smith, agree in contract to use any best management practices. Then maybe this could be used as an exhibit to the contract itself. And some examples might be, maybe the Farmer Rinker wants the cattle to be weaned early, to be using certain vaccinations, use creep feeding, or maybe require certain DNA testing. All right, let's talk about the third type of contract, which is a flesh agreement. And I have drafted a few of these, including one for my brother. And flesh agreements can be done in multiple ways. Somebody could be buying a flesh, or they could be selling a heifer or a cow and reserving a flesh. So I've seen it both ways. Okay, and I'm just going to be briefly talking about these scenarios. So if you represent the side of the purchaser, you're going to want to make sure that the contract discusses the minimum number of transferable embryos from the flesh. Like, for example, it might say a minimum of 5 transferable embryos. It's going to say the grade of the embryos. If you recall from earlier in our presentation, we're going to want those grade 1s, possibly grade 2s, but mostly just grade 1s. The contract is going to say about the date of the procedure for the receipt of the frozen embryos. And is there a guarantee that the flesh is what it was ordered? For example, was there a promise that a certain bull's semen was used? And we are people make mistakes, and if it's important that the flesh was with a particular sire, if you're representing the side of the purchaser, you're going to want to see that guarantee and then note any liquidated damages in case there was an error. On the flip side, if you represent the seller, you're going to want to think about things like payment terms, shipping expenses. You want to ensure that the seller is not responsible for the transfer of the embryos into the recipient cow or responsible for any birthing problems that may occur, okay? So if they take these embryos and put them into, a heifer or some cow that's not a good recipient cow, that's their problem. If you represent the side of the seller, that's what you want to transfer that liability there. You also want to make sure that the transfer is done with a certified technician, and the seller would also benefit from a split above the guaranteed minimum. So this is a little bit of industry speak, all right? So sometimes what I've seen in contracts is that a promise that there's 5 embryos, and then the buyer and the seller are going to split anything above that. So if there's a really good flush, and let's say there's 15 embryos out of the flush, well, then the purchaser is going to get 5, and then the 10 are going to then get split between the buyer and the seller, all right? So if you are the side of the seller, you're going to want to negotiate something like that. So what's being done right now with other species Well, as I mentioned at the onset of our presentation, embryo transfer is not used near as readily in the sheep, goat, pig, and horse industry, but I'm going to briefly mention a little bit about that. With sheep and goats, it's predominantly done with surgical method. And this is with, upon opening the sheep or the goat, a catheter is then inserted into each uterine horn, followed by an injection of phosphate buffer solution, PBS, which produces a current to flush the embryos. There's also a non-surgical method with sheep and goats, and this is with punctures that are made into the abdominal wall. Okay, so with that in mind, it makes sense that if you are drafting or reviewing an embryo transfer contract that's done with sheep or goats, you're going to want to note the type of procedure, whether it's surgical or non-surgical. And if a party is purchasing frozen embryos, the contract should think about things like the type of preservation that's used, the type of substance used to thaw, and the stage at which the embryos were frozen. Now, with pigs, again here, it's also mostly with surgical embryo transfers. So it makes sense with the pig industries that the embryo transfer contracts are going to discuss the methods, whether it's surgical or non-surgical, and the methods used to recover and transfer the embryos, the stages of the embryos which are transferred, how long the embryos were preserved. And here's something that's interesting. Even the breed of the recipient pig should be noted in an embryo transfer swine contract. In preparing this presentation today, I learned that Mission, and I'm so sorry if there is a hog person listening to this presentation and I just slaughtered the pronunciation there, that Mission gilts are known for high embryo survival. After doing some research, this breed of pig, they're quite prolific, actually. They have very large litters of about 15 to 16 piglets. And they're not the prettiest type of pigs. They've got large, droopy ears. But I think it's very interesting that they are known for high embryo survival. So these Mission pigs, these sows, might be really good Recept sows in the pig industry. Now with horses, it's again done very rarely in the horse industry as well, and this is for a few reasons. Number one, the pregnancy rate is lower, okay? And then number two, and this is something that I just recently learned in preparing for this presentation, that the limit, that some of these horse associations actually have limits on the foals that can be registered for a particular mare. Now this varies from horse breed association to horse breed association. So for example, with the Arabian and the Quarter Horse Association, you can only register one foal per mare per year. Okay, so there doesn't really seem to be a big advantage into using the embryo transfer versus the natural, although it might make more economic sense depending on the horse operation, okay? But with the Saddlebred Association, one mare can have up to 4 foals per year, and there seems to be no limit with the American Paint Horse Association. So I didn't search all of the horse breed associations, but I thought that was an interesting point to keep in mind if you were the drafting or the reviewing attorney. So because of that, you're going to want to note that in the embryo transfer contract, the number of foals that the mare had this year, for example. You're going to want to note the type of procedure, the number of foals that the mare is allowed to have per year according to the breed association, the stage of embryo that's being used. And if the embryo is being shipped long distance, include the date and the time the embryo is packaged for the shipment. So we only have a few more minutes, so I'm going to spend this time just talking briefly about the general contract provisions. If you have a recipient agreement, a breeder agreement, a flush agreement with cattle, or perhaps you're working with an embryo transfer contract with other species, no matter the contract, here are some basic things to think about. Number one, a lot of these parties, a lot of livestock producers, horse breeders are doing business under a DBA, right? Some might be doing business under an LLC or a different kind of entity, but oftentimes it's a DBA. My own father, he's an example. My family farm is called Rinker Simmentals, and it's the legal name of my family's farm is actually Kurt and Pam Rinker, doing business as Rinker Simmentals, okay? So it's important that the contract should actually name who the entity is. And you'd be surprised when farmers and ranchers and horse breeders all start doing business with one another. They aren't aware that there's actually a legal entity that exists, or who is the owner that's behind a particular entity. So if there is a DBA, make sure that DBA gets properly memorialized in the contract. This is a great time for an attorney to ask if they are a DBA, whether or not they have filed a certificate of assumed name. That's the term that we use here in New York. Your state might use something different. And in some states, like New York, you can't enforce a term of a contract if you have not filed a certificate of assumed name, and that is under New York's general business law, okay? So check the law in your state on that area, check to see if your client has filed a certificate of assumed name, and make sure the contract properly identifies the parties according to their legal entity if they have one. And if one party is a corporation or an LLC, do a quick check to make sure that party is in good standing. The choice of law should be in the contract itself. It probably makes the most sense if you're dealing with two parties that are in two different state lines, but it's very easy to include this. Farmer Rinker is in Illinois. Let's say Farmer Smith is in Indiana. What choice of law prevails? I am a trained mediator, so I'm a little biased. I think that almost all contracts should have a mediation provision of some sort. I also think that there should always be an exception to a mediation clause, that parties should be able to go to court if there is an emergency, if somebody really needs to go to court. Farmer Rinker really needs his calf, and Farmer Smith is withholding it for whatever reason. He should be able to go to court in an emergency. But I think that parties need to be thinking highly about including a mediation clause. And I know I only have a few more minutes, so I'm going to try to briefly touch upon these last few topics. But I'm a mediator that's also part of the New York State mediation program. There are probably over 40 states in the country that have agriculture mediation programs that are within the various states. These agriculture mediation programs tend to focus on two things. One is federal farm programs, and the second is right to farm disputes. So, embryo transfer disputes doesn't really fall into either one of those two categories, but there are some states that are opening up and they have funding to mediate other types of disputes. Please investigate the types of disputes that are available through your state's agriculture mediation program. And then also consider an attorney's fees provision in the contract itself. Very briefly on confidentiality, and I will also be giving an entire presentation talking at Lawline on September the 24th on protecting the food and agribusiness, managing contracts, trademarks, and non-disclosure agreements. So I will be going in excruciating detail on this topic in about 1 month. And I also have a JD Supra article that's written on this, available at jdsupra.com, my page specifically. It's titled Maintaining Confidentiality for Your Farm or Agribusiness with Non-Disclosure Agreements. Just wanted to note that if the parties have not signed already a non-disclosure agreement, then they might want to consider having a confidentiality clause in the embryo transfer contract. A few more things. I like to have my embryo transfer agreement say that the parties agree to comply with federal, state, and local laws, including farm animal cruelty laws, right? So does the contract need to enumerate proper animal handling techniques? It's up to you. But if either party has a certification or gone through an animal health assurance program, I think it's great to go ahead and memorialize that as well. I spoke last April on ag-gag laws, and so perhaps undercover video surveillance is a concern to your client or the other party, where you might see a provision in there about the use of smartphones. It doesn't really apply to every transaction here, but I just wanted to point that out. I have an outline again on my JD Supra page. It's titled Ag-Gag Laws Through the Lens of a Livestock Producer, and it goes into some detail on hiring practices. All right, a few practical pointers for attorneys that I wanted to mention. That the cattle industry, the livestock industry, this is a conservative culture. They oftentimes do business on a handshake. It's really important that attorneys do not overcomplicate these transactions and use too much legalese. Agricultural lawyers need to keep it simple and easy to understand for all the parties that are involved. And people in the cattle industry tend to prefer flat fees when it comes to these types of transactions. I do have an article on my JD Supra page that has more about this. I just wanted to note that I wrote a book I got about 2 years ago right now. It's available on Amazon and Kindle. And please keep in touch with me. If you have any questions about embryo transfer contracts, send me, you can contact me pretty much any way you want with the various means of communication, including social media. I'm pretty active on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and even Instagram. I have a food and agricultural law blog. I really appreciate your time and attention here today, and I look forward to hopefully meeting you. And please participate in the other upcoming food and agricultural law programs. Thanks again.